Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the new Sigma lens that a lot of people have been waiting for a long time. This is the new 200mm f2 DG-OS Sport lens. Now, frankly, I'm shocked that Sigma beats Sony to the punch on this one, because this is a lens that a lot of people have been clamoring for a while. And I remember from back in the days when I reviewed Canon exclusively that the Canon EF 200mm f2 LIS was really the halo lens for certain portrait photographers that could just really make that lens sing. Now, of course, this also would be really intriguing for sports, and it is intriguing for sports, though less so than what it might be on L mount, for the simple reason that, as always, there are some constraints that come for third-party lenses on Sony, namely burst rate. That being said, I'm here on beautiful Conrad Beach in Nova Scotia, Canada. I've been shooting some images here and a variety of other places, portrait images, wildlife, and then also shooting just some scenics and nature with it. And so I'll have some great images to share with you throughout the course of this review. Now, in full disclosure, this lens was sent to me by Sigma Canada as a loaner. They have had no input on this review, and as always, this will be a fully independent review that you will see when they do. All right, let's jump in and let's take a look at this bad boy.
This episode is brought to you by Pergear's new Master Series CF Express Type A and Type B cards. The Type A cards are capable of read and write speeds up to 1600 megabits per second, while the Type B cards can achieve a staggering 3400 megabits per second and can sustain a 1500 megabit per second write speed, easily capable of dealing with 8K video files. In my test, I found that I got faster speeds with the Pergear cards than my Sony Tough cards that I often use, and the new Pergear Master cards feature capacities up to 1 terabyte. I relied on these cards exclusively for a recent trip to Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, and they were perfectly reliable for photos and videos. All the Pergear Master cards are shockproof, waterproof, X-ray proof, and temperature resistant, and come with a 5-year warranty to back it all up. Pergear always brings the strongest value too, with the 512GB Type A cards available for about $180, while the 1TB Type B cards cost just $211. You can find more information by clicking the link in the description down below. Thanks again to Pergear for sponsoring this video. So let's take a look at the build and handling here. Obviously, any kind of 200mm lens f2 is going to be fairly large, and this lens is, though the weight at 1,800 grams or 64.2 ounces is considerably less than what we saw from the previous generation. The Canon 200mm L lens was 2,520 grams, so 720 grams heavier. That's very significant. So this lens is heavy, yes, but it doesn't feel particularly heavier than, for example, a lot of 70 to 200mm type zooms, and so I didn't particularly find it onerous to carry around. The lens is 118.9 or 4.7 inches in diameter. Of course, there's a lot of glass in there, and it has 105mm front filter thread. The overall length is 7.9 inches or 203mm. And so it's basically the length of a 70 to 200 f2.8 zoom, but the diameter is larger to accommodate all that extra glass for the f2 aperture. Obviously, a lens like this does necessitate having a tripod collar, and you've got a fairly standard implementation for Sigma, though that is a very good one. There's a tension knob here that allows you to freely rotate that. It does have detents, which I like, at the cardinal positions, every 90 degree position, and so that just allows you to find those more accurately. It doesn't stop you if you want to continue to rotate, but it does give you that little bit of a hint to know that's the perfect place to align. I like the fact that it's got attachments for straps on either side. The foot itself is removable, though only with tools, Allen key tools. It is ARCA compatible, as you can see here, which I like. This foot is a little bit more functional than what we found on the 70 to 200 sport lens from Sigma. For one thing, the foot itself is a little bit longer, I think around 7 millimeters longer, and so it just gives you a little bit more to attach to. It also gives you nearly 10 millimeters of additional depth in between the lens and the actual foot itself, and so it is so much easier to actually carry it by the foot, whereas on the sport lens, that was one of the things I complained about. There just really wasn't room to hardly carry it like that. So to me, it made it a little bit of a less functional foot. So we've got a good implementation here. We have a thorough bank of switches. It's a very feature-rich lens, AF/MF. We've got a 3-position focus limiter. We've got OS, 2 different modes there, standard mode and then panning. Then there's also a custom switch down here, so it has an additional C1 and C2. Now the roads split there depending on whether you're on Leica or on Sony. Here on Sony, those are pre-programmed to 2 additional modes for the optical stabilizer. On Leica, you have or L-mount, you have the option of using a dock to program additional settings there. Tucked down kind of underneath here is the click declick for the aperture ring, and so you have the ability to either have clicks or without clicks. You also have an iris lock on the right side that will allow you to either lock in or out of the manual aperture ring, depending upon whether you don't want to get out of it or you don't want to get into it. I will note on the OS, this is Sigma's OS2 as they call it, and their focus algorithms are stabilization algorithms are pretty much as good as anything I see on Sony. I would say pretty close to the best. This is rated at 6.5 stops, and so that is, number one, considerably better than a lot of recent Sony zooms have been. Also, I found in real-world use that I could get some stable results at 1/8 of a second and very easily get 1/15 of a second stable results. And so it works really, really well. It's good at keeping the viewfinder stable. It's good at giving you good stabilized results. So I like that. It works extremely well. The manual focus ring has nice damping. It's got a bevel in here, so it does fall to hand really nicely, and manual focus is a treat. We have also got 3 redundant function or custom buttons there, and so bottom, left side, and then on the top. And so whatever position you're shooting in, you have one of those buttons nearby. As always, you program the function of that through the camera body itself, and they all share the same function. It's not 3 different functions, one function, but it's about proximity, and so you have one nearby. It does come with a nice lens hood. Now you can see it is a big hood, and so these type of hoods, they don't bayonet on. It uses a tension knob that you lock down here. It does have a really nice rubberized surface, and that not only helps with bumps, but it also gives you the most stable position to set a lens camera combo on, because here you can see that's really not what you want. Anyway, your best position is going to be face down like that if you want to store the camera and lens combination together. Aperture iris has 11 blades. They are nicely rounded. After a while, you will start to see the shape of those blades, but again, the overall impression is going to always be circular. Sigma sport lenses get their most thorough degree of weather sealing. So this lens is thoroughly sealed at the rear mount, all throughout at the various switches and rings, which there's a lot of. There's a fingerprint and oil resistant coating on the front element. It's got it all. This is designed for professional grade use, and it definitely feels like that. Now, one of the things I did note when I had the camera off and I was looking at the weather sealing, and I saw that not only, I didn't expect it to be compatible with teleconverters here on Sony, because that is a limitation that Sony has, but I did anticipate it having it on L-mount, and I saw no reference to that, so I did check with my Sony 1.4 times, and I found that, in fact, yes, there isn't enough room there for that to mount. And so teleconverters will not happen on either L-mount or Sony E-mount. So that's really unfortunate. That's a missed opportunity in my mind, because there's plenty of photographers that can find a use for a 200mm f2.8 and a 400mm f4 lens through teleconverters. And this lens is easily sharp enough to handle that bit of visual degradation that comes with using teleconverters. So I really missed that. That's kind of my biggest ding against the lens itself. Minimum focus distance here is only 1.7 meters, 170 centimeters, and 5.6 feet. So you're only going to get a 0.13 times level of magnification. That's roughly similar to what you get from a typical 85mm lens. And so on the plus side, it's a flat plane of focus, very, very sharp and detailed, even at that minimum focus distance, just not a very high degree of magnification. On a final note, the price $3,299 is really pretty amazing when you consider that all the way back, the Canon equivalent lens back in the day cost right under $6,000, and even still the Fuji 200mm f2, which is an APS-C lens, costs about $5,500. So $3,300 for this lens, that's a bargain. So let's talk autofocus. I've returned to the scene of the crime, so to speak, of one of the places where I did a portrait shoot. And here in this setting, I want you to be able to see just how things look for the video recording in a similar kind of setting. Autofocus here comes from Sigma's newer HLA, which stands for High-Speed Linear Actuator, which is their premium focus system. I really think that Sigma probably waited until they had developed this autofocus system before they began to really take on some of the serious sport lenses. And it's probably a smart move because their older STM focus motor, it was fine for basic stuff, but when it came to sports action, it really just didn't have the overall thrust to keep up with really quick or reactive actions, whereas this lens really does. So for example, I was shooting on a beach and people came with a dog on there. The dog was running fast toward me. I went up for the shots, no problem, immediately stopping action with a high-speed subject like that. So no problem there. Likewise, while this lens is a little bit short for birding, I was able to, there was a heron that was flying across a beautiful setting in Nova Scotia right off Conrad Beach. And so I was able to, in every shot, I was able to get accurate focus, although from a distance, able to stop that action. And so no problem there. You can see from my standard focus test that focus is pretty near instantaneous, and that was on my A7R Mark V. I would say on my Alpha 1, which I'm filming on at the moment, that autofocus was even snappier, and so focus speed is fine. I did notice a little bit of focus sound going back and forth when I was just, forcing pulls back and forth, back and forth. I did hear a little bit of a whine in the focus motor, but under normal circumstances, I never really noticed any kind of focus noise. Now, when it came to the portrait set that I shot here, I had zero problems. Every shot is perfectly focused, whether I was shooting through layers, there was distracting things around. I had no problems with that, and so autofocus was really very good in that kind of setting. Let's jump into another portrait shoot. So we are here at the world famous Peggy's Cove, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to pull out the big dog and just shoot some sea-oriented portraits. So my wife Lana is going to help us out just to get a few shots here and see how it performs. So in this setting, I first shot at Peggy's Cove, and then I also shot on a few shots, candid shots on a beach as well. And in both of those settings, as you can see, results are really well focused there as well. So overall, this lens is amazing for shooting in portrait kind of settings. Now for sports, while I didn't shoot more formalized sports setting, I don't doubt that there is the thrust here to achieve that. My experience says that you're going to get probably about a 90% or a little bit higher keeper rate, whereas you might get more like a 98% keeper rate with a higher end Sony lens. And so overall, I think for most people in most situations, this is going to be enough. With one caveat, here on Sony, if you're wanting full-time autofocus, you're going to be limited to 15 frames per second. And that's whether you're shooting on my Alpha 1, capable of 30 frames per second, or an A9 Mark III, which is capable of 120 frames per second. Now, for most people in most situations, 15 frames per second is probably enough. But for those of you that shoot serious sports and you need even higher burst rate, you may have to look elsewhere. And that is kind of a problem because there is nothing else like this on the Sony platform at this point. You've got Sony's own 50 to 150 millimeter f2, which gives you the maximum aperture, but it's 50 millimeters short. And then you're jumping all the way to the 300 millimeter f2.8 and its very lofty price tag. So I think that for most people that have any kind of reasonable budget, they're going to look at what the Sigma is capable of producing and saying, good enough for me. That's kind of the way that I feel. Autofocus is pretty great. So how about for video work? I found that while shooting with longer focal lengths is always a little bit more challenging when trying to do things like forcing focus pulls, I found that in general focus pulls look okay, other than there being a little bit of pulsing right when you go to settle. It's as if the focus motor moves so fast that it gets to the target and then almost like bounces back before settling on the target itself. Other than that, however, focus pulls look pretty good. There is a bit of focus breathing when you're doing longer pulls like this. However, as we're going to see
here with my hand test that there is less noticeable focus breathing in that smaller transition from my hand to my eye. And as you can see, it makes that transition just fine, though again, focus doesn't always seem 100% confident at the first jump. It's as if it needs to lock a little bit. So I wouldn't mind if a firmware update down the road smoothed that out a little bit. I found though, however, that focus was really great, obviously for settings like this where I'm filming on the lens. I shot this clip while doing the portrait shoot with Jaslyn, and you can see that it does a perfect job as she moves throughout poses of keeping focused on her. So focus, I think, is really solid for the kind of settings I use, and I can see this being a valuable lens for those of you maybe that are shooting movies or documentaries where you want tight framing of people's faces, but with a little bit of working distance. It could be handy for that as maybe a second angle that goes in tighter on faces. I also can see it being valuable for things like I'm doing right now, where I'm shooting in a kind of a full-length scene, but able to get that beautiful separation of subject to the background, shooting at things like f2. And obviously the ability to do aperture racking is going to be useful. I think this lens does have use for video work, but obviously when you're talking about this kind of focal length, it's going to be in more limited type applications than shorter focal lengths. At the end of the day, however, though, focus really does pretty good for the most part, particularly if they can use a firmware update and just smooth out that last little bit of settling. So let's give you the optical breakdown here, and this is kind of an overview. If you want the deep dive, that's going to come at the end of the review. This is an optical design of 19 elements in 14 groups, and that includes 2 FLD and 2 SLD elements making that up. The MTF is pretty close to a straight line. This is one of the better MTF charts that you're going to see. It is very high performing all across the frame. Here's a graph that Sigma actually put together that shows the relative MTFs for their 105mm f1.4, a very high regarded lens from the previous generation, their 70-200 Sport from this current generation of mirrorless, and then the Canon 200mm f2 LIS. And so you can see that this lens easily bests the 105mm f1.4. It is, sharpness-wise, the 70-200 Sport is similar at 200mm f2.8. However, the Sport lens, or the zoom lens, has a lot more astigmatism. So this lens is going to produce better images, and it is definitely better all across the frame than Canon's 200mm f2 LIS. And so it's great optically, as we're going to see. It has a tiny bit of pin cushion distortion, a -4 to correct. In many cases, you don't even want to correct that because, particularly if you're a portrait photographer, a tiny bit of pin cushion distortion is flattering for your models, will make them look a little bit slimmer, and most of them don't mind that. There is a tiny amount of vignette, a +27 to correct, about a stop. And of course, Sigma gets good profile support on L mount where it's native, and here on Sony as well. And so you won't have any issue with those factors. Fringing either of the longitudinal or lateral style is not a problem. There's a tiny bit of fringing before the plane of focus, and not really any kind of lateral CA to C near the edge of the frame. And so it is very well corrected in that regard, and it's optically corrected. It's not relying on software to do all the heavy lifting. As the MTF suggests, this is a lens that is completely sharp all across the frame. I tested on a 61 megapixel A7R Mark V, and even at 200% magnification, the results are just perfectly crisp across the frame. What's more, I saw excellent centering, and so here we have the upper left and the upper right corner, and even though these are corners, you can see that both of them look very consistently excellent. So centering is fantastic. Stopping down to f2.8, you will see a bit of a contrast boost in the center of the frame and maybe a hair more noticeable in the corners, but anything after that, you're basically just stopping down to get additional depth of field because you might get a little bit more sharpness in the corners, but probably be a little bit less sharp in the center as you stop the lens down. What I found is that in shooting landscape type results, I got beautiful results. Even at 61 megapixels, there's great detail and contrast and delineation of fine details all across the frame. It is fantastically sharp. It has fantastic contrast.
And what's more, it really has quite beautiful bokeh as well. It doesn't mean that the geometry is perfect all across the frame. There is a little bit of that kind of cat eye shape near the edges of the frame, but the rendering is really nice and soft. And what sets 200mm f2 lenses apart from pretty much everything, particularly for portrait work, is that amazing amount of subject isolation. You go with a longer focal length and it starts to do kind of odd things with people as far as compression for portrait work. 200mm, you still have a pretty natural framing of people, but you have this just almost cut out effect from backgrounds that allows you to shoot full body portraits that just look brilliant. And so I really love it for portrait work. And I found in other situations where the bokeh could have looked busy, like in this shot with a lot of ocean rocks behind it. No problem there. It all looked really fantastic. Now, obviously, even the mightiest of lenses is going to be affected by diffraction. So as you get to f11, you see a little bit softer, and by the time you get to f22, which is the minimum aperture here, you will definitely see some softening from diffraction there along the way. I even found that flare resistance was good, that the lens, when I was shooting into the sun, that I didn't see any ghosting artifacts, and contrast held up. There was, if anything, just a little bit of a glow that entered in that I found to be flattering in shooting shots like this. The colors look beautiful. It's just a gorgeous lens. Optically, it is fantastic. There's not much to critique here. So in conclusion, this is a lens that frankly I'm a little surprised that comes first from Sigma and not from Sony themselves. This is the kind of lens that I think a lot of people, for different reasons, might be interested in. The fact that Sigma has not only scooped Sony at this point, but really pretty much everyone that I'm aware of on full frame mirrorless at this point, with the only 200mm f2 lens I'm aware of right now with autofocus would be the Fuji, which of course is just for APS-C. So this is a lens that does something that nothing else is really doing. And the fact that Sigma has managed to do it at this price point is really pretty amazing. I look back to 2008 when the Canon EF 200mm f2 LIS was released, and at that point that lens was nearly $6,000 in its MSRP at that point. You fast forward 17 years, add on top of that the increased prices due to tariffs this year, and the fact that Sigma is still bringing this in at about $3,300 US is pretty amazing, at about half the price as what that Canon lens was. So, I mean, here's the deal. If someone else, first party, had brought a lens like this first, you can guarantee it wouldn't have been priced anything like this. And so I think that it remains as an exceptional value. Is it a perfect lens? Well, pretty close. I would, of course, love to see teleconverter support, and I think that that is a missed opportunity, particularly on L mount with all of the Sony limitations aside. I would also like to have seen just a little bit more confidence when it comes to video autofocus in certain settings, but my list of complaints is incredibly small and my list of praises is incredibly long. This lens is beautifully built and designed. It is reasonably light comparative to what equivalent lenses have been in the past. It has tons of features on it. It has great autofocus. It has beautiful optical performance. It's got a lot going for it. So who's this lens for? Well, I mean, it is for people who shoot sports, though you have to be willing to accept the compromises. And again, for the money, I think that the list of compromises is relatively small. In many ways, I think this lens could be even more intriguing for those of you who shoot portraiture, in particular environmental portraiture, because a 200mm f2 can produce images that really no other type of lens can. And so if you've got the room to work out in the environment, it produces those kind of next level images that your competition may not be able to produce, and that could be pretty special. So at the end of the day, I think that this lens is an incredible value, and it's not often that I call a $3,300 lens a great value. Now, if you want more information, you have two options here. You can check out my full text review that is on the newly updated and refreshed dustinabbott.net. So check that out. And beyond that, there is also upcoming right after this a deep dive into the optical performance for those of you that just want to see a little bit more behind the results that I have found to this point.
So let's dive in. Let's take a look. Okay, let's start by a look at vignette and distortion here. You can see on the left, this is the uncorrected image. There's a little bit of a pincushion distortion, and this took a -4 to correct it here on the right. In the corners, there is a little bit of vignette. I used a +27 for the correction on the right. So again, no issue really there at all. You could leave both of these things uncorrected and probably not notice them in 98% of your images. Likewise, there's no issue here with longitudinal style chromatic aberrations. I can see the tiniest bit of fringing before the plane of focus here. Not really much of anything afterward, but you can see that the black to white transitions are really, really clean there. No issue with that. Likewise, if we look at a three-dimensional object, you can see that on all of the shiny bits, there is no fringing to be seen here. Likewise, if we look at the specular highlights, there is no fringing around those. So just not an issue at all. You will note here, and we can see that at the edge of the frame, there's a little bit of the pretty typical cat eye lemon type shape that's there. Not really a big deal. And if you stop down a bit around f2.8, you'll get rounder circular highlights throughout. Lateral chromatic aberrations are also a non-issue. You can see here that black to white transitions near the edge of the frame are nice and clean. So we'll take a look at resolution here. This is on a 61 megapixel Sony a7R Mark V, and these are 200% magnification results. You can see in the center of the frame here that it is flawless. We've already got that moire pattern there because of just how high the contrast and the detail rendering is. If we pan over here towards the mid frame, we can see that it is flawless. It looks amazing there. Contrast and detail all throughout as we look everywhere. A very good consistency from here to here as we move towards the edge of the frame, and right off to the very, very edge, you can see very high detail. Nothing's turning to mush here, even at the very edge of the frame. Likewise, we can see that if we look in the upper left corner, it looks flawless. Upper right corner, it looks flawless. Looking down here to the lower left, it looks flawless. Great centering, great detail and performance all across the frame. Something that stood out to me regarding the resolution and contrast, and then of course that huge maximum aperture, it really pays dividends here. You can see, for example, these figures are at a distance, and so I don't have a favorable ratio at all here between the foreground and the background. If anything, the foreground is more defocused than what the background is, and yet if I go into a 100% magnification level, you can see that the figures look like they're basically just cut right out. They just stand out so perfectly well. That's really, really impressive to me. Likewise here, again, another real-world shot on the move, catching this dog that was running fast. But we can see if we punch into a pixel level that the detail here is just amazing. It's frozen that detail and focused perfectly, and also given us extremely high resolution and contrast. And again, even though we have an unfavorable ratio, I was much further from the dog than what the dog is from the background. And this is a very complex, very busy background. You can see, though, it still looks quite good. There's a little bit of jitteriness there, but by and large, it's just defocused. And so that is fantastic. I found if I stop down to f2.8 on the right compared to f2 on the left, there is very slightly more contrast. You can see that the writing is just a little bit inkier looking, just a little bit more deeper shadow information that is there. Likewise in the mid frame, just a little bit more punch. And if we grab a corner and we look there, we can see again, there's just higher contrast, a little bit more detail that's being rendered here. And so that is your kind of primary improvement. After that, you stop down more for depth of field than optical improvement. Here is an f5.6 real-world image, and so this is obviously a very big setting. This is the Cabot Trail in Nova Scotia, but you can see if we start over down here in the bottom corner, you can see there's just great detail right out to the edge of the frame. You can clearly delineate all the people here in the parking lot here. As we begin to pan deeper into the image, you can see that everywhere that we look, there's just fantastic information right out to the edge of the frame. You know, the little houses and cottages that are there, the person on the beach here. And as we pan towards a different distance, obviously now we're starting to get a little bit of the haze that's starting to impact the image. But you can see that resolution-wise, it is flawless right off into the very edge of the frame up here. All of the information that's there, it's all there, this little, you know, whatever it is, a shed or house that is there, all perfectly rendered. You can see the traffic sign. Again, if we zoom back out, I mean, that's just a little dot here, but you can see that it's capturing all of that information. That's a really, really impressive performance. Of course, even the high-end lenses are going to be impacted by diffraction, which is the result of physics. And so you can see here at f11, the image is starting to soften somewhat due to diffraction, and at f22, which is the minimum aperture, it is obviously softer, though still really quite usable if you're just looking at 100% level of magnification. You just won't have the same degree of contrast and delineation of fine details. So here's what the minimum focus distance and maximum magnification looks like. We'll scrutinize it for a moment. You can see that while the magnification isn't particularly high, the performance is fantastic even at its closest focus distance. With good detail and contrast, we've got a fairly flat plane of focus, and so it's usable in a lot of different situations. Here's a look at the bokeh, and one thing that kind of stood out to me is not just, the soft background, but you focus here on little tiny fine things. You can see how that those are really perfectly rendered. They're not kind of falling apart because of it being, it's almost like really small line pairs, but not having any problem with that. You can see that the bokeh isn't completely circular, but it is very soft and creamy in this setting. This is an image which I knew could be very difficult because all of these rocks in the background, it would be very easy for these to be distracting, but you can see that instead it's still kept nice and soft. There's a little bit of outlining there, but really not bad, and of course the detail on the subject is amazingly good. All of that combines to make this a really fantastic portrait lens. And so here the background is fairly close, but you can see that it's nicely defocused. The detail and skin tones all look really fabulous. This image is one of my favorites, I think, that I took with this lens, and it shows that in this really, it's a complicated scene, a lot going on, but there's beautiful subject isolation and beautiful detail and contrast on the subject, and then just the image as a whole is really pleasing. At more of a medium distance, a little bit more than head and shoulders here, you can see detail is fantastic, and the background is beautifully creamy, a little bit tighter in, and you can see that, again, detail looks amazing everywhere that you look, and the background, of course, is fully defocused at this point. Colors I thought were also really nice. Here's an image of a great blue heron that I took at nice golden hour light, and you can see that it looks really pleasing. Here in bright conditions, this is the famous lighthouse at Peggy's Cove in Nova Scotia, and you can see that the reds look really beautifully saturated, the whites pop nicely, the blues are very pleasant. It's all really good. Finally, when it comes to flare, you can see that the sun is right here out of frame, and there was a lot of mist as it was a very warm day, so kind of as the evening set, mist was rising. But you can see that even though this is a highly backlit image, that it's lots of light flooding it. The image hasn't fallen apart. There's no ghosting artifacts. Here with the sun right in the frame, you can see that there's not any ghosting artifacts. And so overall, even when it comes to flare resistance, the coatings are doing great. This is an optically amazing instrument. So thanks for sticking around until the very end. I hope that the deep dive into the optics has helped you to decide whether or not this bad boy is for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.